one sec. All right. AP judging. So I'm going to, most of you, I think, have already taken like at least one judge test, if I'm not mistaken. And most of people here are currently holding a panel status. So I guess that implies that you want to get chair status for KNC. So I'll try to cover what I think distinguishes panel level judges and chair level judges, especially in written way, what I think you can perhaps consider that would hopefully grant you a chair status. All right. So I'm gonna cover mainly three things. Firstly, judging basics that people should keep in mind. And secondly, how you can compare different arguments. And finally, deliberation and OA. I would just note that the final section on deliberation and OA will take like only a couple of minutes because I think that the first and second section is a lot more important. And deliberation process in a way you can refer to the judge manual or judge, like, what is it? Judging briefing that we will be providing prior to the tournament. So I'll mostly spend my time talking about the first and second section. Cool. So firstly, judging basics that people should keep in mind. So the first thing that I think everybody would probably know already is the fact that judges should evaluate the debate based on clashes. And one thing to note is that there are many different types of the ways in which clashes are generated in the debate. So some clashes could be independent from each other, but some clashes might not. Some clashes might be sort of like one clash is dependent on the other. That depends on how the debate turns out to be. So I think that independent clashes usually look like, for instance, in environment debate, where a team has to argue about benefits to the environment. And then the other team probably argues that more stringent environmental regulation leads to deterring of companies' ability to do things like investment and economic expansion. So that is probably an independent clash where there's one clash about environment, one clash about economy, and then those two things are sort of independent ways in which teams are trying to win the debate. Whereas I wouldn't say in all instances, but in many instances, social movements debate end up having clashes that are sort of dependent on each other. So like, for instance, getting political support is a clash that sort of the other clashes, for example, like which team is better at getting policy change is dependent on. Or if you have like judging experiences, you may have had an instance where like in narrative debate, for instance, there is a disagreement between government and opposition on how the narrative looks like in reality. But that is the pretext to which the other arguments or other clashes might depend on. So according to what the judge credits, in regards to how the narrative looks like in reality, the other sort of like auxiliary impact that teams trying to argue kind of depend on that. So I think that it is also a job for judges to kind of distinguish whether clash that are being generated in the debate are independent from each other or something which is sort of like intertwined. And I think that this is important because something that I noticed in judge tests is that judges tend to give a win based on judges tend to give a win to a team that took all clashes, or try to explain that this team won because they took all clashes that were generated in the debate. But in reality, it is very likely that a team doesn't win all clashes. So in that case, you might want to then consider which clash is dependent on another one, therefore is not really the less important, or for instance, which clash is more important, etc. In the round. And I think that there are three broad ways in which clashes are resolved in the debate. And there's obviously more ways in which clash could be resolved, but I think that there are broadly three. The first is that clash can be won by one team. So this is, I think, pretty intuitive. A team successfully claims certain benefits and disproves the other team's attack that is relevant to that clash. Whereas a clash can also be washed, which is to say, there is a team that tries to claim certain benefit, and the other team ends up successfully disproving that benefit, but they do not explain that that benefit is better achieved on their side of the bench. And that is totally fair strategy for teams to take. Obviously, teams don't have to win on all clashes. And in that instance where a clash is washed, it just means that that ends up becoming not a debate winning material for neither team. So if you took the first judge test, for instance, and if you remember, there was a clash about whether going to prison allows you to get better job training or skills training, which was something the opposition team wanted to argue. And for context, the motion was this house would not punish poor for stealing. And the opposition team was like, going to prison is not bad because you get to get job training. The government was, no, but the job training doesn't lead to social integration because the fact that you went to prison, causes social stigma. So that argument doesn't prove that the government team is better at social integration, but it does disprove the opposition team's push that going to prison allows you to get job training. So in that instance, you can probably evaluate that clash to have been washed, but not necessarily won by the government team. And I think that this is something that a lot of panelists judge miss, which is to say, when you think that a team has successfully rebutted an argument, judges tend to give the team who successfully rebutted the clash itself. But I think that for a team to claim that they have won the clash necessarily, probably it is required that that team explains why the sort of like aspired impact of that team is better achieved. And if they don't do that and just merely disprove, then it's probably fine to believe or assess that clash to have been washed. The final thing is, or the final way in which the clash could be resolved is being deadlocked. So deadlocked means that both teams have their own mechanism to achieve the same outcome, but both of them don't really mechanize, or both of them sufficiently mechanize, but don't really respond to other team. So in the second judge test, both government and opposition tried to say that the narrative that says that motherhood is intrinsically fulfilling, government said that hinders policy development. The opposition said, well, actually, you know what, having this narrative is better for policy development. And I think that both teams have fair degree of mechanization, but they don't really disprove each other's argument. In that instance, both teams' arguments end up standing, and that is a deadlock. And in the instance where clash becomes a deadlock, is also an instance where that clash doesn't become a winning material in the debate. So the reason why I'm starting here is because when you are evaluating clashes, I think judges, especially panelist level judges, need to be a little bit more attentive in really assessing whether a team has crossed the threshold of winning the clash, or did this clash just ended up being a deadlock or a wash. And in the event where those things became a wash or a deadlock, probably you then have to defer to other clashes in the debate and determine the win based on that. So I think sometimes judges are very pressured to always give the clash to a particular team. I just want to note that that isn't really a burden for judges. Like, it's debaters' job to win a clash. And if they fail to do so, it is fair for judges to be like, well, this clash didn't become an important clash in evaluating the overall debate. All right. There are, I think, broadly three ways in which judges can evaluate arguments under the same clash. And this is also how you're able to evaluate which clash is won by which team. So usually in a clash, what ends up happening is that there are competing arguments under that clash. And obviously the team that wins, or obviously the team that has better argument, that is less rebutted, will end up having their argument more robustly standing in the debate. And as a result of that, will probably be able to win a clash. So determining which team is winning on which clash really boils down to evaluating the strength of the argument, both in terms of how the debater have substantiated their argument, as well as how the other team successfully or unsuccessfully rebutted those arguments. And I think that there are broadly three ways in which you can evaluate the strength of the argument, which is one, likelihood, secondly, importance, and finally, relevance. I just want to note that this is just my way of categorizing different metrics. So there are many other ways that you can obviously add how you would like to evaluate arguments. But I think that these three are probably the most basic ones. So I'll explain how you can evaluate each components later on. But broadly speaking, likelihood refers to how likely will certain benefit or harm happen as a result of implementing or not implementing particular policy, or having or not having certain narrative. And often in debates, this is usually fulfilled by mechanization or mechanism. So the more successful a team is in mechanizing their claim or providing mechanism to their argument, the team is essentially proving that their desired benefit is more likely. And therefore, probably you as a judge have more faith in believing that that benefit is likely to accrue. And as a result of that, credit that argument for their likelihood or feasibility, if that's what you would like to use. The second is importance. So there are many instances in which like debaters mechanize their claim well, but don't really explain why their impact is important. Why should the judge care about it? So that has to do with impacting and weighing. And the final thing is relevance. So how relevant are the stakeholders or the benefits in the debate or to the motion? And this also has to do slightly with weighing as well as framing. I think that likelihood is a little bit more intuitive metric, but it might be slightly unintuitive how importance and relevance are different. So I'll first go over how I distinguish those two metrics. So difference between importance and relevance, just in my opinion, is that certain benefit a team tries to claim can be larger in scale. So objectively, it is a little bit more important, but it can be proven to be less exclusive to the motion, or it just applies to less important stakeholders. So in that, like you might have heard of like debaters saying things like, oh, this benefit is important, that is true, but it isn't really exclusive to the motion, or it is not mutually exclusive, or debaters saying things like, oh, this benefit is true, but it only benefits the rich people, so it's less important or less relevant. And I think what that means is, even apart from the objective scale of the benefit, if that benefit is just not really relevant to the motion, maybe that could end up becoming less relevant material and therefore don't really end up becoming a winning material for the debate. I think that this might sound a little bit convoluted. So I'm just going to use an example here, which is this House believes that feminists should discourage women from entering professions that are traditionally female dominated, which was the motion from the most recent rookie tournament. The government side in this debate might argue that, well, we want more women to enter into diverse professions and achieve gender parity, which is probably very big scale argument. You want equal gender representation of every profession, et cetera, et cetera. That is obviously a huge benefit. Opposition team can say that while that benefit could or could not happen, in the process of achieving the benefit, women have to sacrifice a lot of their personal benefits. For instance, they might have to, as a result of feminist discouragement, give up their career aspiration to become nurses to be pushed into becoming, I don't know, like engineers or whatnot. And women would feel like discomfort, huge degree of, I don't know, like lack of self-actualization or not being able to do the things that they want, etc. So I think that especially in minority debates for philosophy debate, narrative debate, you might have heard of debaters making an argument about how individuals would feel. And obviously that's sort of like a micro impact. Like it's not like you're changing the entire economy. You're not having a broad political reform. But those small micro argument can end up being a debate winning material because that is least inexclusive or most exclusive argument, or that applies to most vulnerable people. There are many ways in which debaters can frame their argument to be the most important and end up winning with less important benefit just on the basis of relevance. So I'll explain later on how you can evaluate the relevance of each argument. Yeah, I'm just gonna go through like 3 basic code of conduct before going in depth, what I think judges should do as a base of how they engage in adjudication. So the first is that it is obviously important that judges evaluate likelihood, importance, and relevance of each argument. And in an easier round, usually what ends up happening is that both teams argue or try to achieve a benefit that has like similar importance and relevance to the debate. Then the debate just really boils down to which team was better able to mechanize their claim, hence prove that their benefit is more likely. So for instance, in debates like "This House regrets the rise of shows or films which involve mental suffering and self-harm," in this kind of motion, it is very unlikely that you would hear debaters saying things like, well, actually, awareness about mental suffering or self-harm does not matter. Like, you wouldn't hear debaters saying that. Probably both teams would reasonably come to a concession that moral awareness or good form of awareness regarding these mental suffering is important. Then the debate just becomes whether or not teams were able to sufficiently mechanize that these shows promote like good form of awareness or bad form of awareness. So it does really just boil down to which team was able to mechanize it a lot better, because both teams are presumably trying to achieve similarly important / relevant impacts. In that debate, the judge's role is relatively simple, which is to just evaluate which team was able to more robustly mechanize and which team was more able to attack and disprove the other team's mechanization. That is relatively easier round to judge, in my opinion, and this is probably what you're going to see in mid to low rooms in KNC. Whereas tricky situations occur where you have to evaluate a team that is proving likely but less important benefit, like small scale, like very certain benefit, versus something that is a lot more speculative, something that requires a lot more mechanization, but something that is huge impact or something that is huge scale impact. So those are instances where judges have to be more robust in evaluating which thing to credit more in order to decide which team is winning the round. So for instance, like in family debate, where one team is talking about like better family relationship, which is less important, but like very relevant versus like, oh, if family does this, then like huge economic advantage. That is important, but slightly less likely or needs a lot more robust mechanization. So in these kind of close rounds, judges need a lot more robust rationale. And what I think a lot of panelist judges or like trainee judges end up doing in these sorts of rounds is to just like kind of favor arguments that kind of align with their intuition. So when I deliberate with a lot of like new judges or novice level judges, a lot of them end up saying things like, oh, this argument sounded more impactful, or oh, this rebuttal was nice. But I think that like, I don't think that there's an instance where a team just wins with one single argument or one single rebuttal, and then that just like ends up resolving the close debate. So if you want to credit certain argument, I think you need to be a little bit more attentive. And my advice here would be to apply one of the 3 standards that I explained earlier, whether it was more likely, important, or relevant, and have a justification for why you prioritize one over the other. So for instance, if the competing arguments in the debate were proven to be likely to a similar extent, then if you want to say, oh, both teams did sufficient mechanization, then I looked at the impacting, like to what extent teams were impacting their argument to prove that the benefit that they try to claim is more important. Try to explain to debaters, or try to maybe think to yourself, why you're using importance as a metric to judge that debate. Because sometimes debaters might see that as a sort of like an intervention. If you're just saying like, well, both teams did good mechanism, but this team's impacting was a little bit more nice. The losing team is gonna feel like, oh, but like you're intervening. So that has to probably be avoided. Which is why I think that it is important that you do not evaluate arguments in isolation. So like, this probably is relatable if you have debated a lot too. Sometimes judges say things like, oh, your argument didn't have mechanism. And then you become angry because like, oh, but the other team also lacked mechanism. So if you want to say that an argument was not credited as much because that argument lacked mechanism, the first thing that you need to look to yourself is, why was that lacking mechanism crucial in you not being able to buy their impact? And I think a lot of what I saw in judge test submissions was that judges are fair in saying like, oh, this team didn't sufficiently mechanize their argument. But when I'm evaluating that OA, my question is, specifically what mechanism are you referring to? What that was lacking? Or where was that logical leap happening in this team that made you unable to buy that argument? And the second thing is, if this team lacked mechanism, hence proved likelihood to a lesser extent, did the other team mechanize their claim better? Because it is very likely that both teams lack mechanism to an extent in many debates. So if you were to say that a team was penalized for not having sufficient mechanism, you then have to probably look at, did the other team fulfill their burden on mechanizing a lot better than this team, so that it is fair that you credit this team over the other. So you just have to be a lot more comparative, and explain what you mean by lacking mechanism, because I think sometimes judges use that to like cop out their claim, like cop out their call, like say, oh, you lacked mech, so you didn't win, without sufficiently explaining what they mean by that. Like, what do you mean by having more robust mechanism? Like, how many mechanisms do I need to sell my argument? Like, it's not like mathematically you need like 4 mechs to have your argument sell or sold. So try to be extra robust and attentive when you are trying to say that a team had these deficiencies, in order to fully prove your rationale or justification. I think that this is probably one of the most important advice that I would give to a lot of judges. All right. So I'm gonna now explain how you can compare different arguments and determine which team won a clash. So here I'm gonna explain like how you can evaluate likelihood, how you can evaluate importance, how you can evaluate relevance. I would just also note that this is not the only ways in which you can evaluate those metrics. There are other ways you can do that, but I think that this is the most common and basic ways of evaluating the strengths of each argument. Before that, are there any questions?
If I say you need more mechanisms for and then I see so a judge displaying that was the burden of their logic, and if the judge talking about the burden, I think it could be regarded as like intervention by the judge. So how can deal with that?
Yeah. So that is also very tricky. I'll actually explain that right now. How you can explain or compare the likelihood. So the first thing I want to note, and I think this somewhat responds to that question, which is that when the scale of the impact that a team is trying to claim is large, generally speaking, they need a little bit more mechanism that compared to like low impact argument. So if you want to say like, oh, we're going to achieve like world peace, we're going to solve the like climate change, obviously there needs to be a lot more mechanizations. Whereas if a team is just arguing for like people feeling good, that probably needs a little bit less mechanism than like achieving world peace, right? So generally speaking, the higher impact the argument is trying to claim, the more mechanization is required in order for that argument to be fully credited. And I want to also note that this doesn't mean that just because you thought that the mechanism was lacking, you should immediately discredit that argument. But what you can do is you can buy the impact, but not fully buy it. So for instance, you can believe that, well, maybe this policy is good to decrease gender inequality. Maybe that's going to happen to an extent, but it's not going to solve gender inequality in its totality. So I think that one way you can credit arguments that you thought lacked mechanism is you can buy that impact, but you don't have to buy it to its fullest scope. So you still give some benefit of the doubt to that team, maybe assume that this policy is good in achieving certain benefit, but it doesn't lead to huge scale change. And just to, I think, be a little bit more clear in where I think that, like, how do I say, where I think interventions happen and interventions don't happen is you can try to discredit a team for an under mechanization based on the responses coming from the other team. So for example, obviously when a team is trying to argue that they achieve certain benefits, the other team is hopefully going to respond to that. And then you can then look at whether or not those responses are fair. And if they had a fair responses to disprove this team's argument's likelihood, then you can say that, well, this team lacked mechanism, and that was successfully pointed out by the rebuttal by this team. And because you were unable to, I guess, overcome that rebuttal by adding additional mechanism, that was a reason why I couldn't buy your argument. And I think that this is important because there are sometimes what happens is that the team doesn't really rebut. And therefore a team that doesn't, or a team that did like lazy job in mechanizing their claim end up having their claim standing. And I think that then judges are kind of like, oh, like, but this T-fact mechanism, but they never responded. What should I do? I think that's where you can go back to the thing that I said earlier. You can credit their claim to an extent, but only to a limited extent. So you're not like intervening yourself and setting a standard, saying that these things should be fulfilled for me to buy your argument, but rather you're saying, you didn't sufficiently mechanize, but I'm still willing to give you a benefit of the doubt. Maybe you solved this to an extent, I credit this, but it has to still be weighed up against other claims or other benefits or harms that are being mentioned throughout the debate. I think that's one way to evaluate the likelihood of an argument. I think another thing is that when you are evaluating rebuttals that are aiming to disprove the likelihood, sometimes what happens is that judges kind of like immediately credit a rebuttal for just like being there. But obviously just because there's a rebuttal doesn't mean that all rebuttals are immediately successful. So I think that what judges can do in those instances is to track which part of the argument is this rebuttal attacking. Is this rebuttal attacking the core premise of this argument? Or is this argument kind of like not really attacking the argument and they're just like cherry picking like lower hanging fruit issue that constitute that argument? So I think that you sometimes, especially when you're less experienced in judging, you tend to be very charitable to teams wherein you're like, oh, this team had rebuttal, so they successfully disproved the other team. But you need some degree of rationale in explaining why that rebuttal was successful. And if that rebuttal did indeed disprove the core claim of this team. And the reason why I'm saying this is because what I see oftentimes is that judges tend to show like a bit more preference or favor for the speakers that are coming later. Because obviously when you're coming later, you have arguments in front of you that you have to rebut to. And what ends up happening is you credit a lot of the rebuttals that come at the latter speaker, and therefore either give more speaker scores to later speakers, or end up, for instance, believing that opposition team won because opposition is the one that gets to do the final rebuttal to every argument. Those are instances that I think should be avoided and can be avoided by judges being more robust in just going through whether or not those rebuttals were indeed successful in disproving the likelihood of a particular argument. I also want to note that there are different types of rebuttals. So the first and most common one is counter-analysis. So this team says, well, we can achieve this benefit. Like for instance, I don't know, let's say, what do we have? Like you can say, well, we want more people to become vegetarians because that is good for society, because it decreases the animal consumption, which is good for the environment, etc. So we want more people to be vegetarians. And the other team is like, no, but like if there are more vegetarians, then it harms like animal farms. That's bad for society. That's a counter-analysis, not a rebuttal, because it doesn't disprove this team's claim that like it is good for environment. So you're just explaining why vegetarian lifestyle or the rise of vegetarian lifestyle might be bad for society in another aspect, but you're not really attacking or disproving this team's claim that this is good for the environment. So that is often what ends up happening a lot. And I think that judges then have to kind of discern which one is counter-analysis. And I think what ends up happening is like a lot of judges think that counter-analysis is sufficient to disprove this team's claim, but oftentimes it doesn't. It just is claiming another harm without disproving a benefit. That needs to be discerned. The second, and I think most effective form of rebuttal is just directly disproving the mechanism. So just explaining why, in fact, increase in vegetarian lifestyle don't benefit the environment is more direct rebuttal instead of saying that, look, there could be other reasons that vegetarianism is bad for society. The final thing is that symmetricizing. So you might have heard of claims or rebuttals like, oh, like it's symmetric or it's not mutually exclusive. I think the problem with those kind of rebuttal is that it asserts that it is symmetric, but without actually explaining that something is indeed symmetric. And this might sound a little bit technical, but what I'm trying to say is that when a team is trying to claim that this benefit is not mutually exclusive, judges have to probably ask, is it really not mutually exclusive? Because a lot of the times in social movements debate, where a team says, oh, we need to empower minorities, we need to decrease the discrimination against individuals with like minority attribute, the other team's response to that often ends up being like, well, but minorities are going to be discriminated anyway, so it is not mutually exclusive. And that is fair. Like obviously, like minorities are going to be discriminated on either side of the bench to an extent. But if this team is successful in decreasing the quantity of discrimination from 100 to 80, which is obviously like hypothetically, then that reduction of discrimination by 20 quantity is still a benefit that that team can claim, which means that if a team is claiming that something is not mutually exclusive, you should ask yourself, is that really not mutually exclusive? Is there still some degree of change that this team can claim to happen under their side, even if they're not fully like resolving particular argument problem that they wish to solve? So those are, I think, that rebuttals that judges need to be a little bit more careful in crediting. If a team is claiming that, oh, this is just not mutually exclusive, ask yourself, one, is this not mutually exclusive? Two, has this team proven that this benefit is in fact not mutually exclusive? Three, is the rebuttal that is trying to say that it is not mutually exclusive successfully target the other team's mechanism to indeed disprove that they have some change on their side? I think those are the things that are probably important in evaluating the ways in which teams rebut to each other's claim to win the clash. So I think that the example of this is if you have taken the second judge test that says this house believes that the feminist movement should regret the narrative that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience. The government side of the debate said this narrative pressures women to become mothers and forego other options. And OP's response to that was, oh, even without this narrative, other pressures would still exist. That is obviously true. But, and by saying this, opposition team tried to symmetricize that women will be pressured to become mothers on either side of the house anyways. But that rebuttal is unsuccessful because government side does a lot of job to explain why this narrative in particular instills that sense of guilt to women. Oftentimes that narrative is used by powerful institutions like companies and state or rich people and men in society, which is why this is a particularly effective way of making women become mothers. So in that instance, op side is fair in suggesting that there will be pressure on both sides. But insofar as the government side is able to explain that this narrative in particular pushes women to become mothers, then the absence of that narrative probably means that there's less pressure, even if the pressure is somewhat existing on both sides of the bench. So I think that's one example of how you can evaluate whether the attempt to symmetricize a claim is indeed successful or not. All right. Secondly, on importance then. So the first thing is that if teams have different end goal that they wish to achieve, they may try and win by explaining that the outcome they wish to achieve is far more important. So this is the motion from last year's NEDC. This house believes that China should aggressively shift the investment or industrial focus from coal to renewable energy industry. Obviously, the Gov is going to say it's good for the environment. Opposition is going to say, well, aggressive shift leads to like defunding of the current fossil fuel industries or coal industry. That's bad for the economy because people who are working in that industry will get fired, blah, blah, blah. So both teams have seemingly important argument with, I guess, like fair degree of mechanisms. Then the debate boils down to which team was able to better explain that the kind of benefit that they wish to achieve is just a lot more important in scale and severity. So one way that government team can prove this is to say things like, if a climate change accelerates, it causes future costs. Like, for example, more climate change means that government has to spend even more money in remedying the damage, or more people get sick because of air pollution. Government has to spend money in, I don't know, like healthcare. So even if the costs exist under government side with this transition, the scale of the cost is still smaller because it is confined to short-term cost. Whereas under opposition team, when you just let this happen, it can lead to future costs, and therefore the net amount of money that state has to use probably increases. So by doing so, essentially what government side is doing is that, sure, it is true that economic downturn is something which is bad, but it is more important to focus on environment because that just decreases the scale of the cost that state has to incur on their side of the bench. So these are usually just like one example of how teams can prove their argument to be important. And this, I think, is particularly important when there are two clashes that are competing in the debate, and one team has won one clash, the other team has won the other. And then like judge kind of have to evaluate which clash was more important. Usually that is evaluated based on the question of, has the team successfully argued that their argument is more impactful? Because a lot of the times debaters just, like, for example, say, oh, environment is important, but they do not explain why environment is important. Or they say, well, like, this shift will shrink the coal industry, but do not explain why that shrink is so harmful. So you might want to look at the degree to which teams have explained that their argument or the benefit that they try to claim is like so crucial to the point where that has to be considered over the other. So this is usually where debaters use words like trade-off, like this trade-off is justified, or this compromise is justified, etc. I think those are what you can also look at if in the event where both teams were pretty, I guess, like mediocre in recognizing their claim. And here I think that sometimes judges intervene, which is, I think, something is not very preferable. So like I said, judges say things like, oh, I thought this benefit is more important. Or sometimes judges end up defaulting to like larger scale benefit. So if there's a debate about like solving inequality versus like making people feel good, sometimes people are like, oh, I don't know why making people feel good is more important. So I'm gonna like default to giving the win to a team that says that solving inequality will happen under their side. And I guess this is sometimes fair, but as I've explained, you're injecting your, how do I say? You're injecting your standard of what is more important. So what you want to do, instead of like, I guess this is more about how you package your OA, but you might want to say that this team explained why solving inequality is important to a sufficient extent, but the other team only stopped at saying that people will feel good under their side, but does not explain why people feeling good is more important than solving inequality. So just on the quality of reasonings that are given by each team to impact their benefit, I am willing to credit this team over the other. I think that's more a preferable way of adjudicating the debate instead of just being like, well, this team kind of argued very micro impact. I don't think that's important. You'll probably get more really a good judge score. The third thing is how can teams explain their benefit is more important? So they can do so by explaining that this benefit applies to more people. They can explain that certain benefits aligns with existential needs. So for example, if there's a debate about like one team is winning on more money, the other team is winning about like better social relationship. The team that is trying to win on money can say like, well, it is good to have good social relationship, but it's essential that you have sufficient money to pay for like, I don't know, basic necessities and hospital fee. I don't know, this is just like random impacting, but teams can say that their benefit is a lot more aligned with existential need. Their benefit is applies to a lot more number of people, or their benefit is a lot more long-term than short-term. So those are the ways in which teams can explain the importance of a particular argument. So again, and the final thing is that if both teams explain why their argument is important, because like, I guess impacting is what a lot of even novice debaters do pretty well. They are good at explaining that certain benefit is indeed a benefit. So it would be rare to see around where a team is saying like, oh, we want to achieve economic benefit and never explain why economic benefit is important. So if both teams explained why their argument is important, the first thing that you should do is evaluate the quality of reasonings, because sometimes what ends up happening is debaters say like, oh, this is important benefit, but they do not explain why it is important. They just state that this is important and hope for the best to judge buys for it. Probably try to explain how has a team or how have that team explained that importance? Like, did they explain by scale? Did they explain by severity? Did they explain by this is a long-term benefit? Instead of just asserting that this is more important. And the other thing is, if they have done both, like give sufficient quality of reasoning, maybe apply other metrics like likelihood or relevance. So say things like, oh, I was convinced that both teams' argument is equally important. Then I had to look at whether or not teams were able to successfully mechanize their claim or successfully frame their case or frame their benefit to be more exclusive to the motion. Yeah, so I think that's one way to evaluate the importance. Finally, on relevance. All right, so teams can try and explain why the benefit that a team is trying to claim is not debate winning. So they can say things like, it is not mutually exclusive, or it applies to a group of people that do not matter. So like, again, like in social movements debate, a team might say, oh, this benefit only applies to privileged minorities. We would rather prefer to protect like the more vulnerable minorities because they're more important, more relevant actually, even if the size of that benefit is somewhat similar. Or teams say like not mutually exclusive, something that I addressed earlier when teams say that, well, that impact is symmetric. Again, obviously, debaters should explain why this is true, why that argument is not mutually exclusive, why that argument applies to vulnerable people. And on that ground, judges should also look at whether that team has sufficiently proven that certain impact is indeed not mutually exclusive. Yeah. So I'm gonna now finally talk a little bit about how you should evaluate a close call, which I addressed earlier. So close call refers to like a government team is winning on relevance and the opposition team is winning on importance. And then you have to like kind of look at which argument ends up becoming more debate winning than the other. The first thing that you can say is that, or you can consider is evaluate the extent to which teams have proven or disproven the relevance or importance. So what I mean by this is, like I said, a team can just assert that their benefit is important without explaining why, whereas the other team could be explaining or has given really robust reason why their argument is relevant. Then you might give the win to the team that has more relevant argument just based on the quality of reasoning that backs up that winning metric. And by doing so, you can also look at whether or not teams have sufficiently responded to that impacting or framing. So this team says this benefit is important, and this team says their benefit is relevant. And then the team that is winning on relevance successfully like disproved the importance of that argument. Then maybe you can say, oh, the winning strategy of this team was to win on importance, but the other team attacked that pretty sufficiently. And this team's framing on relevance ended up standing, which is why on the quality of engagement, I gave the win to this team that was winning on relevance. So I think that's one way you can evaluate this. Yeah. So the first thing that you should look at is look at the substantive material that the team has provided to support their case, and then look at how the other team responded to that. Did they not respond? And this impact ended up standing that you had to credit, whereas this team's framing ended up being rebutted pretty sufficiently. Or I guess the last resort could be you can maybe look at the likelihood. Like, so if one team is winning on relevance, the other team is winning on importance, try to look at which argument is more likely, which team was better at mechanizing their claim. I would say this is a little bit risky though, because you're kind of injecting another metric that was not really introduced by debaters. So in that instance, when you are doing that, you need to be extra robust in justifying why you like used likelihood as a metric, because obviously like debaters are going to be angry. It's just like, but we had impacting, or are you penalizing us? So what you can do potentially is just to be like, oh, both teams are very nice, but in comparison to this team who had very, very robust mechanisms, this team lacked mechanisms. So even to the extent that I believe your argument is relevant or important, because this team had a lot more substantive work or spent a lot more time in robustly building their own argument, that is something that I have to still credit as a substantive contribution in the round that this other team lacked. Yeah, but I would just advise not to do that because that sounds risky. So and in most instances, you would be able to determine the results based on the earlier metric. So this, I just advise you to do this as a last resort. All right. So I'm gonna really quickly go through deliberation process and oral adjudication. Hopefully this is relatively less technical point. Before that, is there any question? I know judging is a little bit technical, so it's perfectly fine if you're confused. You can ask questions after this lecture too. But I'll move on. So this is just like really basic stuff. So timeline of delib should be 15 minutes. 2 minutes of individual note review. The final 1 minute should be reserved for ballot submission, especially for this KNC because we're having consensus ballot. And it is good to use timer to keep track of deliberation. Sometimes judges end up deliberating like 30 minutes. That is something that I think should be avoided because that causes delay. Another thing is that I think it is also a quality of chairs to write your OAs concisely. And that's one reason why we are imposing like 500-word limitation. Because if you use 30 minutes with your OA, that's obviously that's a lot of time. You can go through every single thing that was discussed in the debate. But I think that one required capacity of chairs is to pick what has actually been more important, not like go through every single rebuttals that have been mentioned in the debate. Try to explain which thing was actually considered in the round. And that's the reason why I think that it is just important to have your OA a bit concise. And I know that like 500 words is a little bit limiting, but that's something that I think, or at least the Adjudication Core considered when we were like deciding on that. So when you are deliberating, what you can do is to organize that deliberation like 10 minutes or 15 minutes based on clash. So don't go like, oh, Gov argument was like this, opposition argument had like whatever argument, and then like try to explain like how these things interacted. Rather than that, what I do when I'm chairing around is I first ask like, what did you think was the main clash of this debate? And then center discussion around that. And if there are some materials that were not really ending up being a clash, maybe like spare 1 or 2 minutes at the end of deliberation to maybe discuss with your panelists, like, why are we not really considering this as a winning material? So like this team, maybe like team have ran like really random, irrelevant argument. Maybe try to discuss with your panelists why that has been irrelevant, but prioritize other more important things like more contentious clashes and stuff like that. And this is how you probably should also structure your oral adjudication. So for oral adjudication, similar to deliberation, you should explain how teams won based on clashes. So I guess you might have noticed from like the sample OA that Ashkar was disclosing. First, they explain the title of the clash and then like go through each team's main constructive points. And then explain how this other team rebutted that argument, and then assess whether or not that argument was successful or unsuccessful. I think that's more standard way of kind of forming or organizing your clash. I guess it could be strategic to be as detailed as possible, but I would also advise you to not spend too much time on that. I think like, okay, so I'm just gonna make this clear. In your actual oral adjudication, you can be detailed because, I mean, it's good optics. Like debaters like when judges are detailed. But I think that for judge test, instead of going like this team had this argument, 3 mechanisms, these mechanisms had like these like subclashes, whatever. Instead of doing that, you can just flag out that there were 3 mechanisms and kind of go through the titles of those mechanisms. I guess you can also do that in your actual oral adjudication as well if you're confident. Say things like this team tried to run this argument, 3 mechanisms, 1, I guess, A, 2, B, 3, C. Just talk about the title. And I think that what you should do, instead of like listing down what the teams have done, I think you should try to spend a lot more time in assessment. So saying things like the reason why this rebuttal was unsuccessful was because of these reasons. Because one thing that I also noticed when I was reviewing or grading the judge test is that judges like spend a lot of words in explaining the constructives and rebuttals, but they don't really explain how each clashes were resolved. Like, what rebuttal did you end up buying? Why you bought that rebuttal and stuff like that. And I think that that's what kind of reflects your quality as a judge, instead of just like, oh, I'm a good listener. You can listen to the round even if you're a trainee judge. So for you to become like a chair level, I think assessment is the most important part of the debate. And obviously this is not to say like you can just assess it however you want and intervene, but you should assess it in a way that I described based on those metrics that I've addressed earlier. And again, if you did not credit certain arguments or responses, try and explain why you did not credit them, instead of just being like, oh, it was asserted, so I didn't buy it. I think, like, think of you as a debater. Like, if the judge says that to you, you would probably be a bit frustrated. So I think it is important to think of like, how should I structure my oral adjudication to really justify your call, especially against a team that lost the round. So yeah. I think that's a final thing. It was just like a slight tips to get good OA feedback. It's just one, refrain from using words that appear as if you're injecting your opinion. So like I said, things like, I thought your argument was good. It was correct to bring this issue up. It makes your OA appear interventionist. So try to assess the argument based on how the other team has interacted with that argument. Did you think that the rebuttals were fair, etc.? I think that's probably what you mean by average reasonable voter, which is a standard that is like very abstract. But I think that my take on what it means to be ordinary intelligent voter or average reasonable voter is to not have a bias, be open in being persuaded. Like, I guess, yeah, that's probably what I think is good. The second thing is using specific terms used by debater is helpful. Again, a lot of judges are like, oh, government had argument on economics, or government had argument on like relationship. But again, that's just broadly what they argued in the debate. So if you're pinpointing certain argument that were falling under a particular clash, government had argument that addressed like inflation, and government gave 3 mechanisms on how inflation will happen. I think that's a lot more robust. And that's, I think, also a good way to adjudicate the debate, instead of just being like, this team had an economic argument. This then allows judges to more critically evaluate specific mechanisms of particular case. And I guess, again, generic expressions such as this case lacked impact looks very, very bland. Debaters might think you have not tracked the round properly, especially also during like panel deliberation. If you say this to your chair is going to be like, what do you mean by this case lacking impact? Why do you think in that way? So you'll probably not really be able to get like good chair to panel feedback. That's, I think, one more advice that I would give, to be sufficiently detailed. But I guess you have to kind of like balance between being detailed versus like not going over time with your OA or during deliberation. I think that's it. Okay, cool. So wait, I'll stop the